Welcome back to the Morning Blend. Our next guest was born and raised in the Deep South. As a young boy in the 50s and 60s, he was the victim of bigotry and hatred. He grew up to serve our country as a combat medic in the Vietnam War, and he is now a practicing clinical psychologist here in Milwaukee. He wrote this book. It's called The Making of a Psychologist. It's a very personal look at racial tensions that still exist today.
Dr. Earl Bracy is here to talk to us, and it's so nice to have you here. It's Black History Month, and I think it's such an important topic for us here, even in Milwaukee as a city. But how do you feel about, in general, just the topic of racism in our community today? Because I feel like it has a deeper impact to really affect people in today's society.
Right. It's still deeply ingrained in the city of Milwaukee and across the country. For some reason, Milwaukee has this history of being a city that's at the bottom of the totem pole on every variable that you can think of. And that includes segregation in housing, education, or whatever. And I think that this is something that it's changed over the years, but they're more subtle forms of racism. Sometimes I think that the city has gotten better, but then as I drive through the city of Milwaukee, particularly the north side of Milwaukee, you see a great deal of dilapidation in the housing and people's attitudes, and there just seems to be a lot of hopelessness. And hopefully we can come together as a community to try and turn these things around.
You grew up in Alabama, moved to Oak Creek here in Wisconsin when you were about 12 years old. Do you kind of, in a way, I mean, it might sound odd, but do you see the racism and the bigotry and the hatred that you experienced, especially while young, and in some way it had a positive impact on you?
Well, when I was younger, it was more deeply ingrained. And I think that it's lessened over the years. We have a lot, in the city of Milwaukee, there's a variety of people from all over the world. And I think this has impacted the change in the city of Milwaukee, although we still have a long way to go in eradicating racism, but I think it's gotten better. I don't necessarily feel the sting of racism that I felt in the past. It's still there, but it comes in different forms. And I think in our city today, we have what we call flash mobs. And this has gotten a lot of people quite upset. And I think that it causes a big rift between the races. We as black people, we don't really know the main cause. You know, this is a group of kids who decide that they're going to attack people indiscriminately for no reason at all. And I think this is something that we need to all work together to try and eradicate, because what happens is that you get a group of people who may call themselves white supremacists, and they want to come against this trend that's going on. And I think it's deep, but I think it's something that can be brought to the forefront and eradicated.
I think, you know, prejudice, we have to look at our own prejudices and examine, you know, the people around us, because I think it comes in waves of grouping people together, assuming everyone of a certain race or ethnicity or background is doing the same behaviors. And it also comes down to language, too, don't you think? I mean, I think here, you know, in Milwaukee, there's a lot of segregation, and I think it's something to be addressed even across the age platforms. Because I know, even coming from a small town, I grew up in a small town that was predominantly white. A lot of people didn't have the right language. How do I address different ethnicities? What, you know, is it African American? Is it black? You know, what is the word? And that sometimes is a different conversation to have if you are in a situation that you're uncomfortable, you know, asking, don't you think?
Right. That's very true, because there's been a progression over the years. You know, it was colored, it was Negro, it was black, it was African American, it was Afro-American, and even, you know, with the Hispanic population, I get confused sometimes. I'm not sure if it's politically correct to say Hispanic or Latino. So yes,
or
I think
Mexican American.
Exactly. So I think that we should dialogue with each other just to make sure that we're not stepping on toes and that we understand each other.
Speaking of language, you know, I think Tiff makes a good point. There are a lot of words that are very offensive, I think, across the board. And I think that the word should be offensive not just to black people, but also to white people. And I was shocked when I lived in Beaumont, Texas, as a young reporter, that the KKK was still very active. And in fact, people in the city common council were members of the KKK and still wore the robes and the hoods and burned crosses. And I was reading about when you first came to Oak Creek and the police department visited your uncle's home.
That's
and
correct.
they actually, you didn't find out from them, from your relatives until later, the nature of this visit. And the police officers stated, if any more, and they used the N-word, move in, we're going to bomb your house and theirs too. I mean, that had to have been shocking to hear that a police officer would say something like that. An officer, they're supposed to be peace officers.
Right, and that's very true, and at the age of 12 I didn't quite understand the full impact of it. And maybe that's why my uncle and aunt didn't really tell me about it until later on. You know, they didn't want me to get upset because I had a different mindset at that time.
You know, I think it's an important conversation to have. It's an important book that people can read. Where can they find your book?
It can be found at Barnes & Nobles, and it can also, they can go online, Amazon.com.
I think the more we learn, the more we understand, the more dialogue, the more conversations, the more important it becomes that we eradicate all prejudice across the board. So thanks for being here.
Sure, you're quite welcome. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.